Good evening, everyone. I hope people had a good break and a good dinner, and thank you for returning, having eaten the foods and fruits of our Mother Earth. I'm really honored to introduce our next speaker. Her name is Jihan Gearon, and I've known Jihan for about 4 or 5 years now, and she is the executive director of the Black Mesa Water Coalition in New Mexico, which is really an incredible organization on the forefront of so many of the issues we've been discussing. And she's on the steering committee of the Climate Justice Alliance and works with indigenous communities throughout North America in energy development and climate change. And she's from the Navajo Nation. And what I want to say is that Jihan has an incredible perspective that I think that we can learn from indigenous peoples, and has been working on these issues for a very, very, very long time. I originally met her going to United Nations climate change conferences and meeting her at that level, at an international level, working to bring knowledge of indigenous peoples and indigenous rights to those international negotiations. And I was very, very impressed, and you know we've been discussing the last few days about the People's Climate March in New York, and one of the profound things that happened was we really saw through a lot of hard work that frontline communities, indigenous communities led the march. And there was a whole narrative that was designed by all the people who were organizing the march to really create a narrative. And it was finally decided through a lot of hard work in the movement, in great part by the Climate Justice Alliance, which Jihan is a part of, that it was imperative that the communities that are affected most by climate change lead the march. And what was said is the front lines of the crisis, but also the front line of change. And I think those two statements need to be put together, because not only are indigenous people and impacted communities obviously on the front lines of climate change, but also they're really key to solutions. And this is something that Jihan has really stood for and is really implementing in her community, is also the incredible solutions coming out of her community. And she's been a real leader in this work. So please give a warm welcome to Jihan Gearon.
How's everybody doing? All right, good conference? Sweet. All right. I'm going to start by introducing myself in Navajo. Yate Shehe Jihan Gearon Yenishia, Turaji Inish Let on the Kaisaj in the Bashas chain, Lashche Dashachade on the Kaisaj in the Dashanale, Tetsoy Dent Nasha, Doti Shijet Nasha EAC. So, hello again, my name is Jihan. I introduced myself in Navajo. I'm half Navajo on my mother's side, half African American on my dad's side. And I'm from the Navajo Nation, and I come from a community called Fort Defiance, Arizona. Originally from Old Sawmill, Arizona, which, has anybody been to the Navajo Reservation? You guys know where that is? Okay, so Window Rock's kind of around the capital of our Navajo Nation, right on the Arizona-New Mexico border. And I just wanted to say thank you to the conference organizers, and thank you guys all for being here after you probably had a nice warm meal and were feeling quite content. Thanks for coming and listening to what I have to say. I entitled my talk, Navigating Contradictions, a Just Transition for the Navajo Nation. And I've been giving this talk about our work and our ideas around just transition on the Navajo Nation for a while now, so I'm going to try and tweak it a little bit and give you guys a little bit of some of my new thoughts, especially coming out of the People's Climate March and just kind of my observations on the larger climate justice, environmental and climate movements. But first I will start by talking about our work and where I come from on the Navajo Nation. So I guess in a very general sense, the way I think about the term just transition is, here we are. This is the situation we're in with, a fossil fuel-based economy and all the problems that come with that, including climate change, climate chaos, also health problems, contamination and overuse of water, an extractive economy not only of natural resources, but of people, people's labor, people's culture. And then over here is, where do we want to go? What kind of things do we want to see in our communities? Health, clean air, clean water, the ability to live a traditional lifestyle. And then just transition is trying to figure out, what is the question of how do we get from here to there? And what a big challenge that is. And it's filled with contradictions, and how do you get around them, and how do we deal with the situations that we're in now, the opportunities that we have now to create the long-term vision that we have. So I'm going to talk first about the community that I come from, communities that I should come from, nation that I come from, I should say, is the Navajo Nation is big. It's bigger than the state of West Virginia, and it's in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. It's about 200,000 people who live on the reservation, and just as many who live off the reservation in kind of your big southwestern cities like Phoenix, Albuquerque, Page, Flagstaff, that's where I live. And it's a very rural area. 75% of all unelectrified homes in the United States are on our reservation, so it's very common that people don't have electricity, people don't have running water, plumbing, and just like basic infrastructure that you should see mostly everywhere, certainly in this country. We have now almost 70% unemployment. I think that was a statistic that just came out this year, but it's always been around 50%, hovering between 46% and 54% unemployment on our reservation. And the median income on our reservation is $7,500 a year for people who live there. And we also have a really long history of the fossil fuel industry on our reservation. We have, where I come from, like I said, is called Old Sawmill. So there was a sawmill there, and I lived in a region more on the eastern side of the reservation, near this place called the Cheshka Mountains. And so that was kind of one of the first resources to be taken out of the reservation, was timber. We also have a history of oil and gas development, especially on the Utah side of our reservation. ExxonMobil is big there, and so oil development has been happening for a long time. We have a history of uranium mining on our reservation. There are uranium mines that have, early in the century, have been going on for years, and they're still sitting there like uranium mill tailings, just sitting there covered with a little bit of earth. People still get sick off of those things, even though we don't mine uranium anymore. And then, of course, there's also now a big fracking boom happening on the New Mexico portion of our reservation. Just within the past year, that has really boomed, like I said. And of course, we have a history of coal development. Sorry, I'm trying to get over cold. But where I work and our organization works is a region called Black Mesa. The Navajo Nation traditionally the territory is between 4 sacred mountains. One in Grants, New Mexico. In English, it's called Mount Taylor, is the southern boundary. The western boundary is called San Francisco Peaks. In English, that's in Flagstaff, Arizona. And then there are 2 in the Colorado side, which are the northern and western boundaries. And in the Navajo worldview, this territory also represents a home. In Navajo, we call that Hogan. So our traditional homes will be modeled after this territory and the different teachings that are associated with the directions. Within those 4 sacred mountains are 2, southwestern mountains, mountain chains. One is the Cheshka Mountains, which I talked to you about already, and then the other one is Black Mesa, which is where our work is focused. And these are the male and female husband and wife in the home. So there's like a lot of they're like cultural strongholds and have a lot of teachings associated with them. Black Mesa, like I said, is a cultural stronghold. It's a female deity in our way of thinking. And it's also home to 2 coal mines, the Black Mesa mine and the Kanta mine. The Black Mesa mine used to feed the Mojave Generating Station in Laughlin, Nevada, and the Kayenta mine feeds the Navajo Generating Station in Page, New Mexico. I could maybe talk about the Mojave Generating Station later, but I'm going to skip that because we were part of shutting that plant down in 2005, so it doesn't exist anymore. However, NGS is still there. Oh, thank you. NGS is still there. NGS is 2,250 megawatts. So it's one of 7 coal-fired power plants surrounding our reservation. The 3 that are on our reservation are the 3 biggest coal-fired power plants in the western United States. And NGS is the biggest one at 2,250 megawatts. The Navajo Generating Station is also majority owned by our own federal government through the Bureau of Reclamation. It's the only coal-fired power plant built or owned by our federal government, who is also, our supposed to be looking out for us as indigenous nations in the country. So that's a big conflict of interest. But it was built, the reason that our government owns it and the reason that it was originally built was because they needed a way to push water from northern Arizona to central and southern Arizona. Cities like Phoenix, Tucson, they don't have a lot of water. That's like the desert, and they needed a way to get it there. So that's why it was built through a project called the Central Arizona Project. And if you've ever been to Phoenix or Scottsdale, you've seen like huge aqueducts traveling down there and then throughout the city. They have to be pumped up before they go back down into the valley, and that's what the Navajo Generating Station, 1 unit of it, does. So that's why it's built. Black Mesa is home to 11 communities, and the Hopi Reservation is actually right in the middle of the Navajo Reservation. So it's home to both Hopi and Navajo communities. And since the 1970s, they'd been using 4,400 acre-feet of water a year for the mining operation. So the real reason that we got involved because of the impacts to water. Under Black Mesa is also a big aquifer called the Navajo Aquifer. And it's like a big bowl of like pristine ice age water. And it's the only source of drinking water for communities on Black Mesa. So people definitely noticed, especially when you don't have running water and you rely on springs, that those were being dried up and used. Within the past couple of years too, there have been like fissures and areas where the land is sinking in, which are signs of overuse of the aquifer. So this is really why we got involved. Peabody and NGS probably create for us about 1,000 jobs total for miners and for people who work at the plant. 1,000 out of 400,000 people isn't very much, but for a place with 70% unemployment, it's super, super important, and that's why it's so difficult to kind of break our connection and our reliance on coal, especially. So again, just transition. Our organization is trying to think about how do we get out of that situation? How do we get out of something that's so bad for us, yet we're so dependent on for the little pennies that we as a community have. Outside of water impacts, there's also environmental impacts to health. There's been no health study done in the region, but informal surveys of going around to communities and seeing what health issues that they have and how those are associated with things like mercury, sulfur dioxides, nitrous oxides from the plants and from the mine. I visited last summer, a couple summers ago, a man who's an elder. He had worked at the plant for over 30 years. And he lives probably just like a half a mile away from the mine on a dirt road, and he still doesn't have electricity, he still doesn't have running water, he still doesn't have a job, and he has a lot of health problems. And he says that there's just a layer of black that you can see kind of like on everything. around the mine, like on the plants and on the land. So it's obvious that there is pollution happening in the community, yet it's not being used or not being addressed. So how do we get out of this situation? It's a tough situation to get out of, and also these are not communities that people really want to invest in either, right? Besides just issues around economic development, there's also a lot of issues around education and alcoholism, suicide rates, violence. I mean, it's kind of layer upon layer of impacts coming from the history that we have as Navajo people and indigenous people all these hundreds of years. So that's our challenge. And our organization has come up with a few projects that I'd first like to share with you of how do we get out of this. And we kind of see it in two phases. One is that our Green Economy program, run by our staff person, Roberto Nett Lewis. And he's very much about farming. He's very much about traditional lifestyles and traditional life ways. And how do we build an economy that works for us and that maintains our culture and actually builds off of our culture and our traditional life ways. And so that's what he's been tasked with figuring out. And one thing, if you know anything about Navajo people, is that we have sheep and wool, and you've probably heard of Navajo rugs. Pendleton appropriated this, but the original Pendleton blankets and rugs. And how do we strengthen that? Another staff person of ours, Wahela, had spent a week working with her grandma to shear her sheep. And it's hard work, with the hand scissors, trying to hold your animal down, shear off the wool in a good way. And her grandma worked on it. She said it took them a week, and they had about a whole truck bed full of wool. And then they drove it into Gallup, New Mexico to sell it. And that's probably like a 2-hour drive away from Forest Lake, where she's from. And they sold it at one of the trading posts. And how much money do you think they got for it? If you already know the answer, don't answer. How much money? Anybody? $150. Anybody else? 600. What did you say? 5,000. Okay. The answer is $18. Yes, exactly. And when she was telling us this, all of us were like, what? We had the exact same reaction, like, that is not even enough money for gas money to get to town. And, her grandma was kind of like, oh, yeah, that's just how it is. Like, that's the attitude of like, oh, yeah, that's just kind of how it is. I'm realizing now that part of that, too, is that a lot of these people who maintain the lifestyle of keeping animals aren't doing it for money. They just do it because they love their animals, and so it's not a big deal to them that they're not getting money off of it. But I think it's still wrong. I think it's totally unjust, and we're like, I know somebody's making money off of that. And who is it, and how can we bring that back home to our own folks? And so that was the kind of impetus for our Navajo Wool Market Improvement Project. And the first phase of that was to figure out what happens to the wool. So in our region, they're sold at a lot of these major border towns like Gallup, New Mexico, like Page, Arizona. And then it's all collected and sold again at a big auction in Roswell, New Mexico. And then a bunch of companies from Texas come in and buy it and they buy it from there and do things like washing it, dyeing it, these added services, and then it goes on to make final products. So our idea is like, how can we cut out all of those people and do it ourselves? And so the first thing we did was to build relationships with a couple of wool buyers, Peace Fleece and Mid-State Wool Growers Co-op, I believe. And they came and did trainings with some of our families around what is the best way to wash your wool, sort your wool, grade your wool, breed your animals to get you the best price for rugs or for clothing or for yarn, and kind of like teaching those things to our people and then working with them and actually buying wool from them. So the first wool buy we held was in 2012 in Piñon in one town from 8 to 5 p.m. It was really fun. My job was just to like pack all the wool in the big truck, which feels really good after sitting at your computer a long time to use your muscles. But so we raised an estimated $13,000 for people directly to people. What the border towns were giving people was like 10 cents a pound for the wool. And we were able to get it up to $1.25 a pound for the people who actually worked with the companies, and then at least probably 65 cents a pound for everybody else. So it was a big difference, and people really got on board. 2013 we did well, and in 2014, this past year, we sold about 60,000 pounds of wool. So it's about $45,000 that just in a few years, just by hosting a wool buy, it's a lot of work, but it's pretty much minimal effort. I think we've made a huge difference in how much people are getting for that. And there are so many next steps to what are things we can do to create some sort of local businesses out of this. Can we create a wool washing facility? Can we create a Navajo stamp? Navajo wool, Navajo products. Can we create little sheep shearing groups, of the young kids to go out and help the elders to do this stuff? So I think that there's a lot of options there. The other projects that Roberto works on is food sovereignty. So like I said, he's really into growing our own food. And this is more of a, how do we not necessarily grow food to sell? Because I'm sure places like Flagstaff and Sedona would love to, buy kind of local products, traditional products, and food. But the idea is, how can we grow food to provide for ourselves so that we don't have to shop for food, And how can we get this kind of traditional food into the schools, into the senior centers, and things like that, where their food, if you go there, is, pretty much a really bad, cafeteria food, And how can we do that? So that project has been first started for several years just in learning how to grow food traditionally, so without irrigation in the desert. How do you do that? How do you take advantage of the monsoon seasons? And how do you plant so that you're actually able to grow food? And we've been able to learn that. It's funny, the first year we created all these diversions and blah, 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 and the first monsoon rain, it all just washed away. So it was several years and several seasons of learning how to do that, where we're doing really well now. The second thing that we've started to do is to survey the fields. So we had this big idea to figure out what is the capacity to grow food on Black Mesa. And that's a lot more work than we thought it was going to be, so we focused in one community called Blue Gap. And within a summer and a fall, really, we surveyed and GPS mapped all the fields in Blue Gap, which were 130 fields. And we also did surveys and interviews with the people, the farmers and elders who kept those fields, to talk about, what is the condition of the field? Are you using it? What are you growing? What work is needed to be done? Where did it come from? What's the history of the field? So we've been learning a lot of information there. And a lot of it has also been unintentional information, really learning about what the history is of the fields and kind of seeing the breakdown of community fields based on clans. I introduced myself to you in the beginning with my 4 clans. Clan-based system to then a family-based system to then an individual-based system, and how that coincides exactly with producing less food, and those teachings being lost. So that's another thing that we're really learning in that process. And the other thing is kind of a health survey that we did in partnership with Indian Health Services. What do you eat? Where do you buy your food? What kind of health problems do you have? And that kind of information. And trying to build a case for our ability to grow our own food. We started a project to make a GMO-free zone in Black Mesa and hopefully across the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation has its own agricultural project called NAPI, Navajo Agriculture something. But they use GMO seeds from Monsanto. And a lot of people buy those seeds thinking, they're Navajo, they're traditional seeds, but it's not. And we're very afraid of those seeds taking over the rest of the reservation. So we're also really trying to get involved on a policy level of maintaining our own seeds. So that's the other project. How do we do that? I think, and there's a lot of other things that other organizations or communities are doing too. There's ranching. I think there's ecotourism is a big thing that I think can make a lot of add to the economy on our reservation, because I live in Flagstaff. I see busloads of people going through all the time on their way to Grand Canyon, Canyon de Chelly, Monument Valley. Those are all in the Navajo Nation, but we really don't benefit from those tourism dollars where I think that we could. And I think people would actually value learning about these places from the perspective of people who actually are from there and understand what those places are for. So I think that there's a lot of potential there. How do we get the money for projects like this? Who's actually going to invest in these kind of projects outside of the goodness of their own hearts or guilt? You know what I mean? Like, that's a big question that we've been struggling with for a long time. And so I think that's changing. However, the idea that we came up with as a kind of a middle project is the Black Mesa Solar Project. So generally, how can we use the reclaimed mining lands on Black Mesa for an industrial scale solar project? What we've done all this time is to provide energy to the major southwestern cities. Can we continue to do that in a more sustainable way? But the key thing here is that we would actually have to be owners of the solar plant. We don't own NGS. We don't own the mine. We get some jobs and we get some royalties from the coal, selling the coal, but that's it. Imagine if we actually got the money from selling electricity to Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or Nevada Power, or APS, or SRP, you know. That's a lot more money, and I've done the calculations of how many billions and billions of dollars we've given away over the past 50 years, 45 years to these places. In addition to, we're not owners of these places, but we also give the plant and the mine so many things for free. Peabody is allowed to use as much water from the Navajo aquifer as it wants. And so what does it do with, why are there still no paved roads? Because they drive these huge trucks around and just pour water on the roads all the time. Dust abatement is a huge use of the only water in our region. You know, it's like they don't have to pay for it, so of course they're going to go with the thing that's the cheapest. We waive our claim to 300,000 acre-feet of water from the Colorado River for the use of the Navajo generating station. And they use, not all of it, I want to say 250,000 acre-feet or 210,000 acre-feet a year, and the rest just goes to Page, Arizona for free. This is billions of dollars that we've given away. And I just looked at, okay, if this was the cost of water in these places over these past 45 years, that's like $6 billion or something that we've given away, that we have in exchange for 1,000 jobs. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense. So a big part of that project is that we would actually have to be owners and trying to figure out a flip structure that over time we would be the majority and only owners of the solar project. That money can then be reinvested into other forms of economic development that aren't about providing energy to major southwestern cities, not about being a battery. And for me, that's a good example of what I mean when I say navigating contradictions. Because do I believe in large-scale energy development? Personally, no, I don't. Do I believe that our job should be to provide energy, cheap electricity and cheap water to unsustainable cities in the middle of the desert? No, I don't. I don't think that, and I don't want to support that. But I think this is what I mean of trying to figure out, this is what we have, this is what we have at this moment, this is our opportunity, how can we best take advantage of it to get to where we want to go? And so that's what I mean by just transition. What we're trying to create here is an oppositional economy to the economy that we have now. We have to prove that it can actually work for our people better than the fossil fuel economy does. And that's not easy. It's not like our Navajo Nation is on board with this. They're all about coal. It's coal country. Last July, they decided to buy one of the coal mines on the New Mexico side, BHP mine, which fed San Juan Generating Station or Four Corners Power Plant on the New Mexico side of our reservation. They basically just bought, the job of cleaning up the mine is basically what they bought from the company. So it's not like our people are on board. We have to prove this to them. And for example, a good example is bringing it back to the wool project. So one of the communities on Black Mesa, Hard Rock, actually did a feasibility study of can we create a wool washing facility in our area. And it was considered unfeasible because there's not enough water resources for it. Yet, 15 miles away, Peabody uses all of the water that it wants from the Navajo aquifer to keep dust down. You know what I'm saying? So it's like we have to challenge the use of our resources in a place where we have so little resources. And so it's pretty interesting. I ended up talking way longer about our work than I wanted, but I want to add kind of a little bit of snippet around the current kind of political context on the Navajo Nation too. We're in the middle of our election, so we are electing a new Navajo Nation president and new council delegates. There's 24 council delegates to represent the 110 different communities on the reservation. And we just had our primaries, and the two guys who are first and second, and one is named Joe Shirley. He was a former president. He is very smooth, very smart, and all about coal, all about using our coal resources. Our current president, Ben Shelley, was his vice president before that. He actually, when he was in office, tried his best to make it so the president has no term limit, so he could stay in office as long as he wanted. So he's back, he's very popular. The second candidate is a guy named Chris Deschitney, who is a young lawyer. And what I remember him from is he wanted to open a new coal-fired power plant on the New Mexico side called the Desert Rock Energy Project. And that was his big thing that he was pushing several years ago, 2006, 2007. So he also is all about coal. However, people have brought up and challenged Chris Deschitney as a candidate for the presidency because he's not a fluent Navajo speaker. And in order to be Navajo Nation president, one of the requirements is that you speak Navajo fluently, and he doesn't. So now it's become a debate about like traditional, versus old versus young, the importance of language, which are all really good debates, but it's almost putting aside the issues of what vision do these people have, because speaking Navajo or not, being older or younger or not, they have the same vision for a Navajo Nation. So it's like all these layers and complexities of organizing in the region. Another thing I want to talk about, especially with Oriel here, is like women, and the role of women on our Navajo Nation and how that's an issue that factors into these things as well. But I'm going to have to skip that because I'm running out of time. Maybe someone can ask that in a question later. But the last thing I wanted to talk about too is how do we fit in as Navajo people or Indigenous people in this larger movement that we're all working on and engaging in? And I think there's a lot of contradictions there too. I was at the People's Climate March. It was definitely much different than I've ever seen it before. I think it was a bigger movement of impacted communities and a bigger, I don't want to say preference, that's not the right word, but a valuing of frontline communities than I'd ever seen before. And I'm really encouraged by that, and I want to keep pushing us down that direction of valuing the communities who are actually impacted by climate change, impacted by the causes of climate change, like coal in our case, and also impacted by many of the false solutions to climate change, like carbon trading and carbon offsets and clean coal technology and fracking and nuclear power. Like, we are the ones who are impacted by all of these. And I think one of the challenges that we have a larger movement is to figure out really what do we want, like as these different segments of our communities and movements. Because I feel like people are definitely getting excited about the issues of a new economy and a just transition and leaving fossil fuels behind. But then what is the economy that most people see? It's a lot about being community-based and community-owned, and that's all great. But even within our own kind of larger alliances that we participate in with other frontline communities, we have to push the idea that, yes, we want jobs, yes, we want money into our communities, but also that's not the end goal for us. That's part of the transition. We're not going to say, yeah, we've got like money coming into our communities and that's the end of it, because that's not what it's about. What we want is for our communities and also a larger society to value money less and to value jobs less, but to actually build community and build livelihoods and value people being able to take care of themselves. That's something that was stolen from us, as Indigenous people, and that's what we want to get back. So there's that. Mr. Corden is going to be talking about Indigenous peoples' spirituality and life ways, and I think that that's something that we have to offer as well. But it's a big challenge for us, I think, about what's the best way to do that. Like, how do you actually share these things with a larger society in a way that's not going to be appropriated or expected, or, you know, you have people come up to you. Even when we were in New York, and one of the elders that we work with, you know, had said a prayer, and this woman came up to her and was like, "Oh, write down that prayer for me." And she's like, what? You know, but it's like almost like a demanding of us to teach people spirituality or, you know, whatever. And so it's just a weird, hard thing to navigate. And I think that's another challenge that our movement has. And then to bringing it to the issue of partnerships, we actually have a lot of support, especially in the past year, for the projects that we're promoting. The Black Mesa Solar Project, people are really excited about it. You know, they want to invest in a business for Navajo Solar, and that's great. But I think that there's also a simultaneous, if not kind of in advance, strategy of funding and support just for community organizing. Because I don't think it's going to be helpful to see an influx of millions of dollars into a community with 70% unemployment and so many issues. Like, that could easily create more problems than solutions. And so I think that there's a whole area of organizing that needs to also be validated and supported. One last thing that I'll say around partnerships is that a lot of times what I hear from, I guess, more of your mainstream organizations is, you know, well, we don't have time, you know, climate is impacting us. And they look at solving climate change and creating justice and building justice as something they need to navigate between. That's a contradiction that they see in their mind. As where for me, I don't think that those two things are separate at all. In fact, I think one is a solution to the other. And so there are differences in our movement, is what I'm saying. We have come a long way since, you know, my first climate marches in Montreal, where, you know, I was told that, like, racism doesn't exist, to now, you know. It's a big difference that I've been a part of and I'm really proud of and excited about. And I just wanted to take this moment to, like, push those ideas even a little bit more. So I will end there. And I hope that that was useful for you all and gave you something to think about. Thank you.